Chapter 1. The blade fell. The sickening thud of her 15-year-old brother hitting the snow echoed through the silence. Elian was gone. "I am saving you, Fallon," Khazar whispered, his voice devastatingly gentle as he stood over her. Fallon didn't scream. She didn't cry. The grief was so absolute it bypassed her heart entirely, waking the rotting, dormant thing buried deep in her chest. She looked up at the man who had raised her. Slowly, she leaned forward until the skin of her throat pressed directly against the sharp edge of his hovering axe. A single drop of her blood rolled down the steel. Khazar's eyes widened in shock. "Swing, uncle," Fallon rasped, her irises flickering pitch black for a fraction of a second. "But know this. When the abyss spits me back out, I will make sure the monster wears my face when it butchers you." Khazar's breath hitched. "May the light forgive you." He swung the axe down with all his might to finish it. Boom. The earth violently convulsed. The massive iron gates of the sanctuary didn't just open, they blew apart. Khazar panicked. The blade was inches from Fallon's neck, descending fast. It never hit her. A shadow blurred past the falling snow. A large leather-clad hand shot out and caught the descending axe blade barehanded. Fallon stopped breathing. Varkan, the Alpha King of the Brimstone Empire, stood over her. He didn't flinch as the razor-sharp steel bit deep into his palm. His thick, burning alpha blood dripped down the blade, splashing onto Fallon's frozen collarbone. Khazar pulled at the handle, but the axe wouldn't budge an inch. Varkan's grip was absolute. Varkan didn't even look at the priest. His glowing, predatory golden eyes were locked entirely on Fallon. Slowly, effortlessly, Varkan twisted his wrist. The thick oak handle of the battle axe splintered and shattered. He ripped the weapon from Khazar's grasp and backhanded the priest with the flat of the heavy blade. Khazar flew backward, crashing hard against the sanctuary pillars. The remaining cult guards dropped to their knees, pressing their foreheads into the ice. "You," Khazar choked, spitting teeth and blood. "You dare! You talk too much, dead man." Varkan's voice was a low, vibrating rumble that made the stones beneath them tremble. He reached down, his bleeding hand tangling ruthlessly into Fallon's hair, and yanked her to her feet. Her chest collided with his heavy, dark armor. The scent of him wood smoke, winter pine, and overwhelming, suffocating alpha dominance crashed into her senses. "She is infected!" Khazar screamed, crawling backward. "She carries the rot. She is a parasite. Take her, and she will consume your entire empire." Varkan stopped. He looked down at his bleeding hand, then stared into Fallon's defiant, trembling eyes. He raised his thumb, slowly smearing his own blood across her bottom lip. A dark, devastating smirk curved the alpha's mouth. "Then I will conquer a new one for her to eat," Varkan whispered. Fallon's heart violently stuttered. "What?" "The monster is mine," Varkan declared, his voice ringing through the courtyard. "And she belongs on my throne, not in your dirt." "Let me go," Fallon choked out, shoving at his chest. Her limbs were failing. The dormant chimera inside her was starving, thrashing frantically in response to his raw, bleeding power. "You're dying," Varkan stated coldly. "I'd rather die than be your trophy." "You aren't a trophy, you're my vengeance." Varkan clamped his hand around the back of her neck, forcing her head up. He pressed his bleeding palm directly against her mouth. "Drink." She clamped her jaw shut. "No." His fingers dug into her jawline, squeezing with terrifying, inescapable pressure until her lips parted. "Swallow," Varkan commanded. The absolute authority in his tone bypassed her brain, forcing her throat to work. "You don't get to die until I say so." The boiling alpha blood poured over her tongue. It tasted like fire and salvation. The second she swallowed, the freezing courtyard vanished. Her heart slammed against her ribs, once, twice. Then her cells erupted. The veins in her neck bulged, turning a violent, pitch-black color. The darkness crawled up her jawline, burning like acid. "What did you do?" she gasped, her vision turning red. "I woke it up," Varkan said quietly. He didn't let her fall, his grip tightening as her body violently convulsed against him. Fallon threw her head back. She opened her mouth to scream, to curse him to hell. But the sound that tore from her throat wasn't human. It was the deafening, earth-shattering roar of an apex beast. Chapter 2. Fallon woke to the suffocating scent of wealth. She wasn't in a dungeon. She was lying on a bed of black silk, enclosed entirely by floor-to-ceiling golden bars. a massive, literal birdcage placed in the center of a circular stone chamber. She shot up, her heart hammering wildly. Instantly, a blinding acidic pain ripped through her chest. She gasped, doubling over. I wouldn't move so fast. An older woman in dark robes stood perfectly still outside the golden bars. Her eyes were milky white and completely blind, yet she seemed to look right through Fallon's soul. Who are you? Fallon choked out. Ileana, High Priestess of Brimstone, the woman said, her voice devoid of pity. And you are the Alpha King's new shadow. I am no one's shadow. Fallon grabbed the bars to pull herself up. The moment her skin touched the metal, a terrifying thing happened. Fallon didn't mean to do it. Her jaw snapped shut. Her teeth ground together with the sickening sound of cracking bone. Her head aggressively jerked toward the priestess like a feral dog scenting meat. Fallon stumbled back in horror, clutching her own throat. What was that? Ileana didn't flinch. That was the chimera. It smelled the faint trace of magic in my blood. It wanted to bite me. Fallon stared at her hands. The skin was mapped with stark, pitch-black veins. The darkness pulsed with her heartbeat, a freezing ache settling deep into her marrow. The Alpha's blood awakened it fully, Ileana stated. It is no longer dormant, it is starving, and it has tasted Alpha magic. It will never accept anything less. The freezing ache flared into a burning agony. Fallon dropped to her knees, her fingers digging into the silk sheets. How do I kill it? You don't, you feed it. The priestess stepped closer. You must absorb his aura, his heat. If you go too long without his proximity, the beast will hollow you out. It will eat your organs one by one. I will not be a leech. Fallon wheezed, her vision blurring. You already are. Ileana tilted her head. The heavy sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the corridor. He is here. The massive iron doors swung open. The temperature in the room instantly plummeted. Then, the scent hit her. Wood smoke. Winter pine. Pure, unapologetic alpha dominance. The moment Varkan stepped into the room, the agonizing pain in Fallon's chest vanished. It was replaced by something infinitely worse. A ravenous, humiliating craving. The chimera didn't recoil from the tyrant. It purred. It violently lunged against her ribs, demanding she drown in his aura. The biological need was so intense it made Fallon dizzy. Leave us, Varkan commanded. Ileana slipped out, the heavy doors shutting behind her with a definitive boom. Varkan stood outside the golden bars. He wore a dark, unbuttoned tunic that clung to the brutal musculature of his chest. His glowing golden eyes watched her tremble on the floor. You did this to me, she breathed heavily. She wanted to claw his eyes out, but her lungs were desperately pulling in the air he exhaled. I kept you breathing. Varkan pulled a heavy iron key from his pocket. He unlocked the cage door, leaving it wide open. He didn't rush toward her. He didn't touch her. Instead, he walked slowly to a velvet armchair inside the cage and sat down. He spread his legs in a posture of absolute, arrogant control. Fallon pressed herself against the back of the cage. Don't touch me. Varkan's lips curled into a devastating smirk. I don't have to. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled the collar of his tunic wider. He exposed the thick, tanned column of his neck, the absolute epicenter of his scent and power. The smell of his pheromones flooded the cage. Fallon's black veins pulsed violently. The monster inside her shrieked. Your pride says you hate me, Varkan murmured, his golden eyes dropping to her trembling lips. But your blood is begging for me. Crawl over here, little monster. Take what you need. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Fallon's body moved before her mind could stop it. She pushed off the floor. Her movements were jagged, desperate. She walked toward him, step by agonizing step, her eyes locked onto his exposed throat. Varkan leaned back, a dark gleam of victory in his eyes. He waited for her to drop to her knees. Fallon reached the chair. She leaned down, her face was mere inches from his neck. She could feel the blazing heat radiating from his skin. Varkan let out a low, satisfied breath. The spike. Fallon's eyes suddenly snapped clear. Instead of burying her face in his neck, she violently clamped her jaw shut. She raised her own hand and mercilessly bit down on her own wrist, sinking her teeth so deep that human blood spilled over her chin. The sharp, agonizing pain shocked the chimera. The craving shattered. Varkan froze, his victorious smirk dropping instantly. Fallon ripped her arm away from her mouth, spitting her own blood onto the immaculate floor between his boots. She took a deliberate half-step backward, staring down at the Alpha King. "Keep your heat, tyrant," she rasps, her voice trembling but utterly defiant. "I'll let it eat my own heart before I beg you for a scrap." The silence in the cage was deafening. Varkan stared at the blood on his boots. Then he looked up at the girl standing over him. The annoyance in his eyes vanished, replaced by a dark, terrifying fascination. "Fascinating," he whispered. Chapter 3. The golden chain connected Fallon's bandaged wrist directly to the armrest of the Alpha King's throne. It wasn't a restraint, it was a leash, a public declaration of ownership. She sat rigidly on a smaller seat beside Varkan, overlooking the Great Hall of Brimstone. Hundreds of Alpha Lords and military generals filled the cavernous room, their eyes locked onto the human girl with the pitch-black veins crawling up her neck. The chimera was starving, violently clawing at her ribs, but the self-inflicted bite on her wrist had bought her a fragile sliver of lucidity. "Stop shaking," Varkan murmured. He didn't look at her, slowly swirling a goblet of dark wine. "I am not shaking from fear," Fallon gritted out. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the golden chain. "I am shaking because I want to use this to strangle you." Varkan let out a low, rough chuckle. "I'd like to see you try." Before she could snap back, the heavy oak doors of the great hall violently slammed open. The temperature in the room spiked. 3 men strode in, wearing the immaculate, blinding white robes of the sanctuary. Fallon stopped breathing. Khazar's envoys. The lead priest, Kalam, halted at the base of the dais. He didn't bow. He looked at Fallon with the exact same sickening, sorrowful pity Khazar had weaponized. "Alpha King," Kalam announced, his voice echoing off the obsidian walls. "I bring a message of mercy from High Priest Khazar. He is willing to overlook the destruction of the Northern Gate." "Generous," Varkan mocked, leaning back in his massive throne. "In exchange," Kalam continued, his eyes darting to the gold chain, "you will return the abomination. She must be cleansed in the holy pyres. Her soul is crying out for salvation." "She isn't crying at all," Varkan replied smoothly. "In fact, she prefers my company." "She is a parasite." Kalam's voice rose, losing its calm facade. "She will rot your court from the inside out." "Then let it rot," Varkan stated, his tone dropping into a lethal, quiet register. "The girl stays. Leave my hall before I decorate the walls with your robes." Kalam's jaw tightened. "High Priest Khazar anticipated your arrogance. He sent a gift to ensure the girl remembers her true home." The priest reached into his robes and pulled out a small iron reliquary. Fallon's chest instantly seized. The air turned heavy and foul. Kalam flipped the latch. It wasn't gold or jewels inside. It was a handful of gray ash. "Your brother's remains, Fallon," Kalam whispered with a twisted smile. "Blessed by the light." A blinding, violent white flame erupted from the box. It wasn't normal fire. It was pure, concentrated holy magic, designed to purge the dark. The magic swept across the hall like a shockwave, slamming directly into the dais. Fallon screamed. It wasn't a sound of grief. It was a sound of absolute biological agony. The holy magic burned her from the inside out, terrifying the starving chimera. In a fraction of a second, her restraint shattered. The skin on her neck tore as thick, razor-sharp black scales violently erupted. Her eyes rolled back, flooding entirely with pitch-black ink. Her fingernails elongated into jagged claws, carving deep gouges into the stone armrest. The great hall erupted in chaos. Lords drew their swords, shouting in terror as the human girl turned into a monster right before their eyes. "Kill it!" Kalam yelled over the panic, holding the burning ashes high. "The demon reveals itself." Varkan didn't draw a weapon. He didn't step away from her. In one fluid motion, the Alpha King stood up, ripped the massive, heavy direwolf fur cloak from his shoulders, and threw it entirely over Fallon. He wrapped his huge arms around her mutating, thrashing body, burying her against his chest, completely shielding the monster from the eyes of his court and the burning magic. "Silence!" Varkan roared. The sheer force of his alpha command cracked the stone pillars. The entire hall froze. Varkan turned his glowing golden eyes to Kalam. The priest took a step back, the box of ashes trembling in his hand. Varkan drew the broadsword from his back in a blur of motion. He didn't walk down the stairs. He leaped. The heavy steel flashed in the firelight. Kalam shrieked, collapsing to his knees. His severed right arm hit the floor with a heavy thud, still clutching the holy box. The blinding white fire instantly extinguished. Varkan stood over the trembling, weeping priest. "Tell Khazar." Varkan's voice was a terrifying, quiet promise. "If he ever sends his light into my empire again, I will personally feed his heart to my queen." He turned his back on the envoy and walked back up the stairs to the throne. Fallon was a mess of tangled limbs under the heavy fur cloak. The holy magic had severely damaged her. The chimera was frantic, feral, and starving for energy to heal the burn. As Varkan sat back down, pulling her onto his lap to inspect her, Fallon's head snapped up. She didn't see the Alpha King anymore. She saw survival. She saw the most potent source of power in the room. Her solid black eyes locked onto the thick, pulsing vein at his neck. "Fallon," Varkan started, his hand reaching up to touch her scaled cheek. She lunged. Right on the throne, in front of 1,000 shocked nobles and the bleeding envoy, Fallon buried her fangs deep into the side of Varkan's neck. The entire hall gasped in horror. A general stepped forward, drawing his blade. "My king!" Varkan threw up his hand, stopping the entire room with a single, absolute gesture. He didn't push her away. He didn't fight back. Instead, the tyrant closed his eyes. He tilted his head back, fully exposing his throat to the monster, his massive hand coming up to gently stroke her dark hair as she violently drained his blood. "Drink deep, little beast," Varkan murmured, his voice echoing in the dead silent hall. "Let them see who owns the dark." Chapter 4. The metallic taste of alpha blood finally faded from her tongue. Fallon opened her eyes. The golden cage was gone. She was lying in the center of a massive, dark oak bed. The heavy velvet curtains were pulled back, letting in the pale moonlight. Her body felt impossibly light. The excruciating burning in her chest had vanished. The chimera wasn't thrashing anymore. It was deep in a satisfied, lethargic slumber. The heavy door clicked open. Fallon immediately pushed herself up, pulling the thick black sheets to her chin. It wasn't Varkan. A massive, scarred man with a battle axe strapped to his back walked in, carrying a silver tray of steaming food. Beta Brix, the Alpha King's executioner. He didn't look angry. He looked exhausted. Brix dropped the tray roughly onto the nightstand. "Eat." Fallon stared at him, her heart pounding. "Why aren't I in the dungeon? I attacked your king in front of the entire court." Brix snorted, crossing his massive arms. "Yeah, you did, and it was the quietest the Great Hall has been in 10 years. So, thanks for that." Fallon blinked, entirely thrown off guard. "What?" "Listen, girl," Brix said, a gruff smirk pulling at his scarred cheek. "Usually when people disagree with Varkan, heads roll. You chewed on his neck instead of my head. I appreciate it. Eat the damn stew before it gets cold." He turned on his heel and walked out, shutting the door behind him. Fallon stared at the closed door. A strange, unfamiliar feeling settled in her chest. A breathing room. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like a prey animal. A few minutes later, the door opened again. This time, the temperature dropped. The scent of winter pine and wood smoke filled the room. Varkan stepped inside. He had washed off the blood. He wore a simple, loose white shirt, but Fallon couldn't look at his eyes. Her gaze was locked on the thick white bandage wrapped securely around the right side of his neck. Her fangs had done that. She had ripped into him, and he had let her. Varkan walked over to the bed. He didn't carry a weapon. He held a small, dark glass jar. He sat down on the edge of the mattress. His weight dipped the bed. "Turn around," he commanded quietly. Fallon didn't move. "You let me mutilate you. You took what you needed to survive," Varkan corrected. He unscrewed the lid of the jar. A sharp, medicinal scent filled the air. "Turn around, Fallon. Your scales are receding, but the skin underneath is torn." Slowly, hesitantly, she turned her back to him. She pulled her hair over her shoulder, exposing the raw, cracked skin of her neck. Varkan dipped his fingers into the cold salve. When his hand touched her neck, Fallon flinched. But his touch wasn't brutal. It was terrifyingly gentle. The Alpha King, the Butcher of the North, meticulously rubbed the soothing ointment into her wounds. The agonizing sting of the holy fire melted away. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered to the dark wall. "I am a monster." Khazar was right. Varkan's hand stopped. His fingers lingered on her bare shoulder. "Khazar is a fanatic who burns children." Varkan's voice was a low, dangerous rumble. "You are not a monster. You are a survivor. He pulled his hand away and stood up. Before he left, he reached into his pocket and placed something small on the silver tray next to her untouched food. Fallon looked over, her breath hitched. A single fragile white flower, a snowdrop. The holy fires burned the northern fields to ash, Varkan said quietly, walking toward the door. But they missed a patch near the border. I thought you should have one. He didn't wait for a thank you. He walked out. Fallon stared at the white petals. Her chest tightened, but it wasn't the chimera, it was her own heart. The walls she had built around her soul violently cracked. A tear slipped down her cheek, hitting the dark sheets. She picked up the flower, bringing it to her chest. For one dangerous, foolish second, she allowed herself to believe that the tyrant might actually be her savior. The door creaked open. Fallon quickly wiped her face, expecting Brix to return for the tray. But it was Ileana. The blind priestess stepped into the room. She didn't look peaceful. Her face was a mask of cold, hard stone. You are crying, Ileana noted, her sightless eyes fixed on the bed. You think he is kind, don't you? Get out, Fallon said, her voice hardening. She held the snowdrop tighter. Ileana didn't leave. She walked straight to the bed and threw a thick, leather-bound folder onto the mattress. It landed with a heavy thud. The red wax seal of the Brimstone Empire was stamped on the cover. Read it, Ileana commanded. Fallon frowned. What is this? You think High Priest Khazar is your greatest enemy? You think the Alpha King is your protector? Ileana let out a bitter, joyless laugh. Look at the date on that decree, Fallon. 5 years ago. Fallon slowly reached out. She broke the wax seal. She opened the heavy parchment. Read what the Alpha King ordered his alchemists to dump into the Ebonjaw Abyss 5 years ago. Ileana's voice turned into a venomous whisper. Read how the chimera parasite was truly born. Fallon's eyes scanned the black ink. The words blurred, then sharpened into a horrific, undeniable truth. Chemicals, dark magic waste, dumped directly into the water supply of her home village, ordered and signed by Varkan. The snowdrop slipped from her trembling fingers. Varkan hadn't just saved her from the monster. He was the one who created it. Chapter 5. Fallon stared at the black ink. The imperial wax seal at the bottom of the parchment was the exact same shade as her brother's blood. By absolute order of the Alpha King, Varkan of Brimstone. Subject: chemical and dark magic runoff disposal. Location: Ebonjaw Abyss. 5 years ago. The exact year the water in her village turned foul. The exact year the black, rotting veins first appeared on her mother's neck. The year the children started dying in their sleep. The white snowdrop slipped from her fingers. It hit the dark silk sheets. It didn't look like an apology anymore. It looked like a gravestone. Ileana stood at the foot of the bed. Khazar swung an axe at your neck, the blind priestess whispered, her voice like grinding glass. But the Alpha King poisoned your blood. He is the architect of your hell. He made the rot that killed your family. And now he strokes your hair and expects you to purr. Fallon didn't cry. The tears from just a few minutes ago evaporated. A profound, absolute numbness swallowed her entirely. Why are you showing me this? Fallon's voice was completely hollow. Because the sanctuary wants you dead. And the king wants you as a chained pet. Ileana reached into her heavy robes. She pulled out a long, wickedly sharp brimstone dagger forged of black steel. She dropped it onto the mattress, right next to the decree. I want to see what the monster does when the leash is off. Ileana turned and vanished into the shadows of the corridor, leaving the door slightly ajar. Fallon sat in the silence. She looked at the white flower. She looked at the black dagger. Her chest didn't ache. The chimera wasn't thrashing. For the first time since she arrived, the starving parasite and the human woman were in perfect, terrifying agreement. The heavy iron door swung open. Varkan stepped inside. He held a scout's map in one hand, looking over his shoulder to speak to a guard in the hall. Tell Brix to double the perimeter around the eastern. He shut the door. He turned around. He stopped. Varkan looked at the bed. He saw the broken wax seal. He saw the open decree. He saw the crushed snowdrop. Then, his glowing golden eyes met hers. He didn't look shocked. He didn't scramble to explain or deny it. The Alpha King simply lowered the map. His jaw tightened as the suffocating weight of the truth settled into the room. Ileana shouldn't have given you that, Varkan said. His voice was quiet, completely lacking its usual overwhelming command. Fallon didn't scream. She didn't throw the decree at his face. She didn't ask him why. She simply stood up from the bed. She picked up the black steel dagger. Varkan didn't draw a weapon. He didn't call for his guards. He didn't even brace himself. He stood perfectly still in the center of the room, his broad chest entirely exposed in the loose white shirt. He watched her approach. "I was going to tell you," Varkan murmured. His golden eyes were filled with a dark, heavy resignation. "If it brings you peace, Fallon, strike." She didn't hesitate. She didn't blink. With the unnatural, blurring speed of the beast inside her, Fallon closed the distance. She drove the heavy black steel blade straight into the center of his chest. The sickening, heavy impact echoed through the quiet room. Varkan didn't try to block it. He didn't even flinch. He let out a sharp, choked gasp as the blade sank all the way to the hilt. He looked down at the dagger buried in his chest, then slowly looked back up into her cold, pitch-black eyes. He didn't raise a hand to fight back. He just stood there, letting the woman he ruined take his life. Chapter 6. The hilt of the dagger pressed hard against his chest. Dark red rapidly bloomed across the white fabric of his shirt. Varkan didn't push her away. He slowly raised his massive hand and covered hers on the hilt. He didn't try to pull it out. He held her hand exactly where it was. "You have every right," he whispered. That quiet, absolute acceptance broke the final thread inside Fallon. Not her heart, her humanity. She didn't want his guilt. She didn't want his apology. She wanted to unmake him. The chimera answered her rage. The black veins on her arms didn't just pulse, they erupted. Thick, armored scales ripped through her skin. The transformation wasn't a painful struggle this time. It was a violent, willing surrender. The shadows in the room actively bent toward her, swirling around her body like a hurricane of dark magic. She yanked the dagger out, tossing it aside. It clattered uselessly against the stone wall. She didn't need steel anymore. Her hands, now tipped with jagged obsidian claws, slammed into Varkan's bleeding chest. The Alpha King was thrown backward with the force of a battering ram. He crashed through the heavy oak table, violently splintering the wood, before collapsing onto the cold stone floor. He coughed, a stark line of blood running down his chin. He didn't reach for the sword leaning against the wall. He didn't shout for his guards. The monster stalked toward him. She towered over his fallen form, her eyes entirely pitch black, her jaw unhinging to release a low, deafening growl that shook the glass in the windows. Varkan forced himself up. Not to stand, but to kneel. His breathing was ragged. The wound in his chest was catastrophic. Yet, as the apex beast of shadow and scale stood over him, ready to strike, the tyrant of brimstone only tilted his head back. He completely exposed his throat to the monster he had created. "I owe you this life," Varkan rasped. His glowing golden eyes locked onto her soulless black ones. There was no king left in his voice. There was only a man begging for judgment. "Tear me apart if it gives you back your form." He dropped his arms to his sides. "Take it, Fallon," he commanded softly. "Take it all." The beast didn't hesitate. The chimera lunged. Massive, razor-sharp claws pinned his broad shoulders to the floor. The brutal impact cracked the stone beneath him. Her jaws clamped down directly over the thick, beating pulse of the Alpha King. Varkan didn't scream. He didn't struggle. His heavy hands came up, not to push the monster away, but to grip the dark scales at her waist. He pulled her closer, burying his hands in the darkness as she began to aggressively drain his life force. He was letting her consume the very magic that sustained him. The deafening, powerful thud of his alpha heartbeat echoed in the silent room. Thump, thump. Then, the rhythm began to falter. Slower, slower. His grip on her waist loosened. His massive hands fell limp against the cracked stone. The heavy thud of the Alpha King's heart stopped completely. Chapter 7. The silence in the room was absolute. The deafening heartbeat under her hands was gone. The chimera let out a low, confused rumble. It had just consumed the very source of its creation. The dark magic of the Alpha King didn't rot the beast further. It overwhelmed it. It neutralized it. The pitch-black scales covering her arms suddenly began to dissolve into ash. The monstrous form violently melted away, leaving Fallon kneeling on the cracked stone floor, gasping for air in her human skin. She looked down. Varkan lay perfectly still. His chest was covered in blood. His golden eyes were closed. The tyrant of brimstone was dead. Fallon stared at him. She had wanted this. She had wanted to unmake the monster who had poisoned her home. But as she looked at his pale face, The victory tasted like ash. "Get up," she whispered. He didn't move. "Get up," she shouted, her voice breaking. She grabbed the collar of his ruined shirt, shaking his massive frame. "You don't get to die to make yourself a martyr. You don't get to take the easy way out." Nothing. Panic, raw and blinding, seized her throat. The thought of him being truly gone ripped a hole in her chest that the chimera's hunger never could. She couldn't let him die. Not when he had surrendered. Not when he had given his life to give her back hers. Without thinking, Fallon brought her wrist to her mouth. She ruthlessly tore open the same wound she had made in the golden cage. Human blood now completely pure, wiped clean of the chimera's dark taint, welled up. She leaned down, pressing her bleeding wrist directly against Varkan's pale lips. "Drink," Fallon commanded, her tears hitting his cheek. She echoed the exact words he had used in the sanctuary courtyard. "I said, drink. You don't get to die until I give you permission." She forced his jaw open, letting her purified blood spill onto his tongue. 1 second. 2. A massive leather-clad hand suddenly shot up. It clamped around her waist with bone-crushing force. Varkan's eyes snapped open. The gold in his irises was blinding, burning with a ferocious, resurrected fire. He violently gasped for air, his broad back arching off the stone floor as her blood kick-started his dead heart. Fallon was yanked downward, crashing flush against his hard chest. The tension in the air instantly shattered. They were a chaotic tangle of limbs, ruined clothes, and blood on the cracked floor. Varkan's grip on her waist was entirely possessive, an unbreakable, iron vice. His chest heaved violently against hers as he pulled oxygen back into his lungs. He didn't speak. He just stared up at her. The air between them was so thick it was suffocating. The dynamic had irrevocably shifted. She had killed him. She had saved him. The debt of the poisoned village was paid in blood, and a new, terrifying bond was forged in the space between life and death. Varkan raised his free hand, his knuckles brushing against her trembling jawline. "You are mine," Varkan rasped. His voice was rough, ruined, and completely absolute. "Through life and death. Mine." Before Fallon could even catch her breath to reply, the ground beneath them violently trembled. It wasn't a localized quake. It was a massive, concussive blast that rattled the entire fortress. The deafening, terrifying shriek of war horns tore through the night sky. The heavy iron door to the bedchamber was kicked wide open. Beta Bricks stood in the frame. His battle axe was already drawn, his face covered in soot and blood. He didn't even blink at the highly compromising, bloody scene on the floor. "My king," Bricks barked. "The eastern barrier is breached." Varkan's jaw tightened. He didn't let go of Fallon's waist. He slowly sat up, pulling her with him. "Who?" "The fanatics," Bricks spat, his grip tightening on his axe. "High Priest Khazar didn't just send envoys, he brought the entire Holy Vanguard. The city is burning." Chapter 7. The silence in the room was absolute. The deafening heartbeat under her hands was gone. The chimera let out a low, confused rumble. It had just consumed the very source of its creation. The dark magic of the Alpha King didn't rot the beast further. It overwhelmed it. It neutralized it. The pitch-black scales covering her arms suddenly began to dissolve into ash. The monstrous form violently melted away, leaving Fallon kneeling on the cracked stone floor, gasping for air in her human skin. She looked down. Varkan lay perfectly still. His chest was covered in blood. His golden eyes were closed. The tyrant of brimstone was dead. Fallon stared at him. She had wanted this. She had wanted to unmake the monster who had poisoned her home. But as she looked at his pale face, the victory tasted like ash. "Get up," she whispered. He didn't move. "Get up!" she shouted, her voice breaking. She grabbed the collar of his ruined shirt, shaking his massive frame. "You don't get to die to make yourself a martyr. You don't get to take the easy way out." Nothing. Panic, raw and blinding, seized her throat. The thought of him being truly gone ripped a hole in her chest that the chimera's hunger never could. She couldn't let him die. Not when he had surrendered. Not when he had given his life to give her back hers. Without thinking, Fallon brought her wrist to her mouth. She ruthlessly tore open the same wound she had made in the golden cage. Human blood now completely pure, wiped clean of the chimera's dark taint, welled up. She leaned down, pressing her bleeding wrist directly against Varkan's pale lips. "Drink," Fallon commanded, her tears hitting his cheek. She echoed the exact words he had used in the sanctuary courtyard. I said, drink. You don't get to die until I give you permission. She forced his jaw open, letting her purified blood spill onto his tongue. 1 second. 2. A massive leather-clad hand suddenly shot up. It clamped around her waist with bone-crushing force. Varkan's eyes snapped open. The gold in his irises was blinding, burning with a ferocious, resurrected fire. He violently gasped for air, his broad back arching off the stone floor as her blood kick-started his dead heart. Fallon was yanked downward, crashing flush against his hard chest. The tension in the air instantly shattered. They were a chaotic tangle of limbs, ruined clothes, and blood on the cracked floor. Varkan's grip on her waist was entirely possessive, an unbreakable, iron vice. His chest heaved violently against hers as he pulled oxygen back into his lungs. He didn't speak. He just stared up at her. The air between them was so thick it was suffocating. The dynamic had irrevocably shifted. She had killed him. She had saved him. The debt of the poisoned village was paid in blood, and a new, terrifying bond was forged in the space between life and death. Varkan raised his free hand, his knuckles brushing against her trembling jawline. You are mine, Varkan rasped. His voice was rough, ruined, and completely absolute. Through life and death. Mine. Before Fallon could even catch her breath to reply, the ground beneath them violently trembled. It wasn't a localized quake. It was a massive, concussive blast that rattled the entire fortress. The deafening, terrifying shriek of war horns tore through the night sky. The heavy iron door to the bedchamber was kicked wide open. Beta Bricks stood in the frame. His battle axe was already drawn, his face covered in soot and blood. He didn't even blink at the highly compromising, bloody scene on the floor. My king, Bricks barked. The eastern barrier is breached. Varkan's jaw tightened. He didn't let go of Fallon's waist. He slowly sat up, pulling her with him. Who? The fanatics, Bricks spat, his grip tightening on his axe. High Priest Khazar didn't just send envoys, he brought the entire holy vanguard. The city is burning. Chapter 7. The silence in the room was absolute. The deafening heartbeat under her hands was gone. The chimera let out a low, confused rumble. It had just consumed the very source of its creation. The dark magic of the Alpha King didn't rot the beast further. It overwhelmed it. It neutralized it. The pitch-black scales covering her arms suddenly began to dissolve into ash. The monstrous form violently melted away, leaving Fallon kneeling on the cracked stone floor, gasping for air in her human skin. She looked down. Varkan lay perfectly still. His chest was covered in blood. His golden eyes were closed. The tyrant of brimstone was dead. Fallon stared at him. She had wanted this. She had wanted to unmake the monster who had poisoned her home. But as she looked at his pale face, the victory tasted like ash. Get up, she whispered. He didn't move. Get up, she shouted, her voice breaking. She grabbed the collar of his ruined shirt, shaking his massive frame. You don't get to die to make yourself a martyr. You don't get to take the easy way out. Nothing. Panic, raw and blinding, seized her throat. The thought of him being truly gone ripped a hole in her chest that the chimera's hunger never could. She couldn't let him die. Not when he had surrendered. Not when he had given his life to give her back hers. Without thinking, Fallon brought her wrist to her mouth. She ruthlessly tore open the same wound she had made in the golden cage. Human blood now completely pure, wiped clean of the chimera's dark taint, welled up. She leaned down, pressing her bleeding wrist directly against Varkan's pale lips. Drink, Fallon commanded, her tears hitting his cheek. She echoed the exact words he had used in the sanctuary courtyard. I said, drink. You don't get to die until I give you permission. She forced his jaw open, letting her purified blood spill onto his tongue. 1 second. 2. A massive leather-clad hand suddenly shot up. It clamped around her waist with bone-crushing force. Varkan's eyes snapped open. The gold in his irises was blinding, burning with a ferocious, resurrected fire. He violently gasped for air, his broad back arching off the stone floor as her blood kick-started his dead heart. Fallon was yanked downward, crashing flush against his hard chest. The tension in the air instantly shattered. They were a chaotic tangle of limbs, ruined clothes, and blood on the cracked floor. Varkan's grip on her waist was entirely possessive, an unbreakable iron vice. His chest heaved violently against hers as he pulled oxygen back into his lungs. He didn't speak, he just stared up at her. The air between them was so thick it was suffocating. The dynamic had irrevocably shifted. She had killed him, she had saved him. The debt of the poisoned village was paid in blood, and a new, terrifying bond was forged in the space between life and death. Varkan raised his free hand, his knuckles brushing against her trembling jawline. "You are mine," Varkan rasped. His voice was rough, ruined, and completely absolute. "Through life and death. Mine." Before Fallon could even catch her breath to reply, the ground beneath them violently trembled. It wasn't a localized quake. It was a massive, concussive blast that rattled the entire fortress. The deafening, terrifying shriek of war horns tore through the night sky. The heavy iron door to the bedchamber was kicked wide open. Beta Brix stood in the frame. His battle axe was already drawn, his face covered in soot and blood. He didn't even blink at the highly compromising, bloody scene on the floor. "My king," Brix barked. "The eastern barrier is breached." Varkan's jaw tightened. He didn't let go of Fallon's waist. He slowly sat up, pulling her with him. "Who?" "The fanatics," Brix spat, his grip tightening on his axe. High Priest Khazar didn't just send envoys. He brought the entire Holy Vanguard. The city is burning. Chapter 8. The sky over Brimstone was bleeding. Ash rained down like gray snow. The deafening roar of clashing steel and dying men echoed through the fortress walls. Varkan didn't stagger. Despite the catastrophic amount of blood he had just lost, despite the fact that his heart had literally stopped minutes ago, the Alpha King moved with lethal purpose. He ripped his heavy broadsword from the cracked stone floor. "Stay here," Varkan commanded, his breathing heavy but his voice absolute. Fallon wiped her own blood from her mouth. "You are half dead. You can barely hold that sword. I am still the king." He turned his glowing golden eyes to her. The absolute authority in his gaze left no room for debate. "And you are mine to protect. Do not follow me." He stalked out the door, Beta Brix right on his heels. Fallon stood in the ruined bedroom for exactly 3 seconds. Then, she followed him. The main courtyard was a nightmare. The heavy iron gates had been blasted inward. Hundreds of sanctuary zealots in blinding white armor poured into the dark fortress. They wielded weapons blazing with white, holy fire, clashing against Varkan's dark-armored Alpha Guard. In the center of the carnage, a massive war chariot carved its way through the defenders. High Priest Khazar stood at the helm. He wore immaculate ceremonial robes. His broken arm was bound in a golden splint. He wasn't wielding a weapon, he was holding a massive, burning white torch. He didn't look like a general leading a slaughter. He looked like a father arriving at a festival. "Fallon," Khazar's magically amplified voice boomed over the chaos. It was sickeningly warm. Varkan stepped onto the grand balcony overlooking the courtyard, his broadsword resting on his shoulder. He immediately positioned his massive frame at the top of the stairs, creating an unbreakable physical barrier between the courtyard and the fortress. Fallon stepped out onto the balcony right behind him. Khazar's eyes found her. His face lit up with a terrifying, ecstatic smile. "Look at you!" Khazar yelled, spreading his arms wide. The holy fire in his torch flared. "You survived the beast, my little bird. The light has preserved you so that I may finish the work." "He is insane," Varkan gritted out, gripping his sword with both hands. His knuckles were white. "Come down to me, Fallon," Khazar pleaded, his voice cracking with twisted emotion. "Let me wrap you in the holy flames. It will only hurt for a moment. Then your soul will be pure. I will walk you to the gates of heaven myself." Fallon stood frozen. She looked at Khazar, the uncle who had taught her how to read, the man who had slaughtered her 15-year-old brother because he thought death was a mercy, the man offering her a funeral pyre wrapped in the word love. Then, she looked at the broad, bleeding back of the Alpha King standing in front of her. Varkan was the monster who poisoned her village. He had ruined her life. But when the abyss opened, he didn't offer her a holy death. He gave her his own blood. He gave his own life. He had dragged her back to the world of the living, screaming and fighting. Khazar's love was execution. Varkan's cruelty was survival. "Varkan," Khazar called out, his smile dropping into a mask of pious disgust. "Step aside. You are bleeding out. You cannot stop the light." "I am the dark," Varkan rumbled. He took a heavy step forward, raising his broadsword. He was preparing to charge a literal army alone in his weakened state. You will have to step over my corpse to touch her. No. Fallon's voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the din of war like shattered glass. She stepped out from behind the Alpha King. Varkan whipped his head around. Fallon, I told you to stay back. She didn't listen. She walked right past him. She reached out and firmly pushed his heavy sword arm down. You already died for me once today, Varkan, Fallon said quietly, not looking at him. Her eyes were locked dead onto Khazar. It's my turn. Fallon! Khazar cheered from his chariot, tears of joy streaming down his face. Yes, come to the light. Accept your salvation. I am not coming for salvation, uncle, Fallon yelled back. She closed her eyes. She didn't fight the chimera. She didn't cage it. She invited it out. But this time, it wasn't a feral, starving parasite. When she had consumed Varkan's life force, the beast hadn't just fed, it had evolved. It had merged with her perfectly. The transformation was explosive. Pitch-black scales violently erupted across her skin, forming a magnificent, terrifying armor of dark magic. Jagged obsidian spikes tore through the back of her dress, her hands elongated into lethal, scythe-like claws. The sanctuary zealots stopped fighting. A wave of pure, paralyzing terror swept through the courtyard as the human girl vanished, replaced by an apex monster of legend. Purge it! Khazar screamed, his face twisting in horror. Kill the demon. The chimera slowly opened its eyes. They weren't the soulless, pitch-black voids of a mindless beast anymore. They were human, they were fiercely intelligent, and the irises burned with the exact same blinding, predatory gold of the Alpha King. Lucid, aware, in absolute control. The monster spread its massive, shadowed arms, letting out a deafening, earth-shattering roar that blew the holy fires out. She stood alone at the top of the stairs, staring down an army of 10,000 men. Chapter 9. The Holy Vanguard charged. A tidal wave of white armor and blazing holy fire surged up the grand stairs. They didn't see a girl. They saw a demon from their darkest scriptures, and they intended to burn it to ash. Fallon didn't draw a weapon. She was the weapon. She leaped. When the chimera collided with the front line, the impact sounded like a thunderclap. She didn't bite. She didn't tear flesh. She slammed her massive scaled hands into the stone stairs, unleashing a shockwave of raw black magic. Dozens of elite zealots were thrown backward like broken dolls. Their holy shields shattered into dust. Their blazing weapons flickered and died. Hold the line! A commander screamed, thrusting a spear of concentrated light at her chest. Fallon didn't dodge. She let the spear hit her dark scales. The holy magic didn't burn her this time. It absorbed into her armor, feeding the beast. She swiped her heavy claw. The kinetic force alone sent the commander flying across the courtyard. She carved a path straight through the invincible vanguard. She was a hurricane of shadow, dismantling the army not with slaughter, but with absolute overwhelming force. No one could touch her. No one could stand before her. In less than 5 minutes, the vanguard was completely broken. Men dropped their weapons and fled in sheer terror. Only the chariot remained. Fallon stalked through the groveling survivors, the heavy thud of her steps making the ground tremble. She stopped at the base of the chariot. High Priest Khazar stood at the helm. He wasn't running. He wasn't trembling. He was smiling. He opened his arms wide, looking down at the towering, terrifying beast. Yes, Khazar cried out, tears of fanatic joy spilling down his cheeks. Show them your true face, demon. Strike me down. Burn me. Let the world see my martyrdom, so my death will ignite a holy war that will cleanse this earth. He wanted to die. He needed to die by her hand to prove he was right all along, to prove Elian's death was a necessary sacrifice. Fallon stared up at him, the chimera's jaw unhinged. But when she spoke, it wasn't a roar. It was her own voice, layered with the deep, vibrating rumble of the beast. You don't get to be a martyr, Fallon said. Khazar's smile faltered. What? Fallon stepped onto the chariot. She didn't raise her claws. She reached out and placed one large, scaled hand directly over Khazar's heart. You don't get to die a hero, she whispered. She activated the chimera's hunger. But she didn't drain his life force. She drained his magic. She drained his faith. A violent, blinding white light was forcefully sucked out of Khazar's chest, flowing directly into Fallon's black scales. The high priest gasped. His eyes went wide with sudden, unutterable horror. No! Khazar shrieked, clutching at her arm. Stop! Give it back! He felt it leaving him. The absolute certainty. The divine connection he claimed to possess. The arrogant belief that his atrocities were blessed by a higher power. Fallon was hollowing out his soul, stripping away the delusion that protected his sanity. The white light completely vanished. Khazar collapsed onto the floor of the chariot. He looked at his trembling hands. The holy aura was gone. "Where is it?" Khazar sobbed, crawling backward. He looked up at the gray, ash-filled sky. "Where is the light? Why can't I feel it?" "It was never there," Fallon said, coldly, standing over him. "You were just a murderer." The truth crushed him heavier than any physical blow. The realization that Elian died for absolutely nothing snapped his mind. Khazar clutched his head, releasing a piercing, broken wail of pure despair before his body gave out entirely. He died not from a wound, but from the unbearable, crushing weight of his own emptiness. The false savior was dead. Fallon stood victorious. But the sheer volume of fanatic magic she had just consumed was toxic. A violent tremor racked her monstrous frame. She stumbled off the chariot. The dark magic surrounding her began to violently whip through the air. The golden alpha control in her eyes flickered. It vanished. Her irises bled into a feral, blinding crimson red. The chimera threw its head back and unleashed a deafening, uncontrolled roar of pure chaos. It was overloaded. It was starving for destruction. The crimson eyes snapped toward the fortress balcony. Varkan's surviving alpha guards instantly raised their weapons. Betabrix stepped forward, hefting his massive battle axe, positioning himself to defend the castle from the rampaging beast. "Hold your weapons!" a voice thundered over the panic. Varkan stepped past his beta. He was bleeding heavily from the chest. He didn't have his sword. He didn't have his armor. "My king, it has lost its mind," Brix yelled, bracing for an attack. "It will kill us all." Varkan didn't listen. He didn't stop. He walked down the stone stairs, entirely unarmed, stepping directly into the path of the snarling, out-of-control monster. Chapter 10. The courtyard was tearing itself apart. The excess fanatic magic Fallon had consumed wasn't just burning her mind, it was fracturing the physical space around her. The chimera didn't recognize friend or foe. Its crimson eyes were locked solely on the largest threat moving toward it. Varkan. He didn't bring a shield. He walked directly into the center of the dark storm. A jagged whip of shadow magic slashed across his face, leaving a deep, bleeding gash. Varkan didn't even blink. He kept walking. The beast let out a terrifying, earth-shaking roar. It raised a massive, scythe-like claw, ready to cleave the Alpha King in two. "My king!" Brix screamed over the roaring wind. Varkan didn't stop. He stepped directly under the descending shadow. He lunged. He threw his massive hands on either side of the monster's scaled jaw, holding the terrifying apex predator completely still. "You are mine!" Varkan roared over the storm. He didn't kiss her. He dragged her down, buried his face into the thick, armored junction of her neck and shoulder, and sank his fangs brutally through the scales. The marking bite. It wasn't a gentle union. It was an absolute, violent anchor. Varkan forced his alpha soul directly into the chaotic, overflowing void of her magic. But he didn't just ground her. He opened his own spiritual gates and swallowed the abyss. He pulled the toxic rot, the chimera's insatiable hunger, and the corrupted fanatic magic entirely out of her body, dragging the curse into his own veins. The shockwave of the transfer blew the remaining ash out of the courtyard. The massive shadow violently collapsed inward. The terrifying armor of scales dissolved, melting back into pale human skin. Fallon's knees gave out. Varkan caught her, wrapping his heavy arms around her trembling frame. She was breathing. She was human. The parasite in her chest was completely, utterly gone. But as Varkan held her against his ruined chest, a single pitch-black vein slowly crawled up the side of his own neck. 3 years later, the golden bird cage was no longer in the master bedroom. It had been moved to the deepest, coldest vault beneath the brimstone keep. Fallon walked down the spiraling stone steps. She wore a gown of heavy midnight silk and the obsidian crown of the empire. The brimstone lords feared her. The sanctuary zealots whispered her name as if she were a god of death. She was the undisputed sovereign of shadows. But down here, in the dark, she was just a keeper. She reached the bottom of the stairs. The massive golden cage gleamed in the dim torchlight. Inside the cage, the Alpha King was on his knees. Varkan was shirtless, his broad chest heaving with ragged, labored breaths. Heavy iron chains bound his wrists to the floor. The left side of his body was covered in thick, razor-sharp black scales. His golden eyes constantly flickered, violently fighting against a feral, blinding crimson red. He was mutating. The chimera he had taken from her was slowly, agonizingly eating him alive from the inside out. He heard her footsteps. Varkan jerked his head up. A low, inhuman growl vibrated in his chest. The monster inside him was starving. Fallon didn't flinch. She pulled an iron key from her pocket, unlocked the cage, and stepped inside. Varkan aggressively strained against the chains, his jaw unhinging, his fangs fully extended. "Leave!" he managed to choke out, his voice a ruined, demonic scrape. "Get out, Fallon, before I tear you apart." "I'm not going anywhere," Fallon murmured. She walked directly to him. She didn't kneel. She stood over the broken, terrifying tyrant who had once ordered her to crawl. She pulled a small silver dagger from her belt. Without a hint of hesitation, she sliced a deep, clean line across her own palm. Human blood, pure, untainted, and warm, welled up. Varkan's crimson eyes dilated. He violently thrashed toward her, the chains screaming against the stone floor. Fallon calmly lowered her bleeding hand, pressing it firmly against his mouth. "Drink," she commanded softly. The exact word he had used to bind her to him all those years ago. Varkan clamped his hands over her wrist, his fangs sinking slightly into her flesh as he frantically drank her blood. It was the only thing that kept the beast at bay, the only thing that preserved his sanity for one more day. Slowly, the crimson faded from his eyes, returning to that familiar, exhausted gold. His body went limp, resting his heavy head against her stomach as he continued to drink. Fallon ran her free hand through his dark hair, her fingers gently tracing the monstrous black scales on his jaw. "I ruined you," Varkan whispered against her skin, his voice thick with self-loathing and a twisted, possessive despair. "I poisoned your home, and I bound you to a monster." Fallon smiled. It was a beautiful, entirely broken thing. She let the heavy golden door of the cage swing shut behind her, the lock clicking perfectly into place, trapping them both inside. "You did," Fallon whispered, stepping out of her shoes to sink to the floor beside him, wrapping her arms around the beast. "And now I get to ruin you. We are even, my king."